welcome to Reducing Demand for Child Sexual Exploitation. I'm Lauren Beal, Senior Program Manager at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. NCJ-FCJ is a national nonprofit judicial membership organization, and we provide training and technical assistance to courts around the country on topics related to juvenile and family courts, including sex trafficking. If you'd like more information about NCJ-FCJ or would like to know more about child sex trafficking, I am including a link to our resource center in the chat. This has lots of information on child sex trafficking, and the video from this webinar will be posted to it at the end of the session. I just wanted to quickly say that funding for this webinar was provided by the Novo Foundation. Points of view or opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the Novo Foundation. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our wonderful speakers and allow them to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, everybody. I think it's afternoon everywhere that people are joining us now. My name is Barbara Mack. I'm a retired Superior Court judge in King County, Washington. I also serve on the board of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. I convened the King County Task Force on Commercially Sexually Exploited Children, which gave me the opportunity to work with our two wonderful presenters today, Ben Gowan and Elisa Bernard. You may have noticed that Kira Dobak was originally listed as a presenter. She was disappointed. She had to withdraw at the last minute. These are trying times, as we all know. We are incredibly fortunate that Elisa Bernard was able to step in without missing a beat, and we're glad to have her and grateful for her being here. I'm going to ask Elisa and Ben to introduce themselves briefly, and then I'm going to come back and talk for just a second before we get into substance. Elisa.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm so was actually very fortunate to have known Kira for many years, and I'm very sad that she can't join us today. I'm glad that I was available today to come and step in. So I am stepping in. This was very last minute, so I do apologize if I stumble a little bit along the way, as this has been a while since I've gotten to present with these two lovely humans. So my name is Elisa Bernard. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for an organization named Thistle Farms. We are based out of Nashville, Tennessee. We have a 2-year residential program for adult women survivors of prostitution, sex trafficking, and addiction. We also have a social justice enterprise, so you may have seen our candles out there in Whole Foods or a number of other places. I have been working in this movement for about the last 8 or 9, maybe 10 years now, actually. And was so fortunate to sit on the Ending Exploitation Collaborative with Mr. Ben Gowan, who is also joining us. I am actually based out of Washington, D.C., where I do public policy work for Thistle Farms and coordinate their advocating body. So thank you so much for having me, everyone. I appreciate being here.
Ben?
Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Gowan. I am joining you from Seattle, Washington. I am a senior deputy prosecuting attorney working for the King County Prosecutor's Office, and I am in my office's criminal division, and my work focuses exclusively on crimes related to sex trafficking and commercial sex exploitation. I handle my own caseload. I have the privilege of working with law enforcement on building a case from the investigation level all the way through a jury trial. I work directly with victims and survivors of the sex trade. And then I also work on a lot of policy level discussions and work advising our county's elected prosecutor, Dan Satterberg, as well as working with our state lawmakers and other civil society organizations like Elisa and her work with Organization for Prostitution Survivors on trying to really address this issue from multiple intervention and prevention points that don't necessarily need or should involve the criminal justice system. As you probably know, this is one of the many societal ills that we cannot arrest or prosecute our way out of. And so I really find a lot of enjoyment and reward in this work when I get to partner with the community in looking at other ways to combat child sex trafficking. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I want to take a minute to talk about what we will cover and what we won't cover here. We are talking about the dynamics and demographics of the market for commercial sex from children and related policy issues. Child exploitation in general, child sexual exploitation in general, is very broad. We are not covering everything that has to do with child exploitation. It would take 2 days of webinars to do that. At the end, you will find a number of slides containing source material. These are examples of some of the work done on the issues we're discussing today, but I want to make it clear that they are by no means exhaustive. They're there so that if you want to do further research, you can start there and expand your own work in this area. Thank you. I am now going to ask the fundamental question, which is, why is the issue of demand important? Ben, would you start off, please?
Sure, and I think it's a fundamental question, and there's some fundamental basic tenets that we should probably discuss early on in this presentation, so sort of set the premise of what we're talking about, right? Why we're here. You know, in the commercial sex trade, there's really 3 entities. The sex buyer, which represents demand, a person in prostitution, or a child sex trafficking victim. Sometimes people refer to themselves as sex workers. These are all folks in the sex trade, whether they're there consensually or not consensually, and they really represent the supply. And then the third sort of entity is a third party, which often is referred to as a trafficker or a promoter, somebody who is facilitating or profiting or enabling that supply and demand to meet up, often with the motivation of financial profits. And, you know, certainly I can understand, at least when I got into this work, like, why are we talking about supply side, demand side economics? Like, this is economics 101. Why are we talking about that in the context of the commercial sex trade? And the reality is because economics is what drives this. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry worldwide, and certainly local, stateside as well. And it's based on the fundamental premise that if there is a demand for something and you can make money off that demand, then there needs to be a supply. The problem that we see in the commercial sex trade, and why, you know, folks like myself are involved in this work coming from the criminal justice lens, is that when demand increases, right, supply tries to keep up with that demand. But there are not enough people who want to voluntarily, consensually engage in prostitution, sex work, you know, you can call it what you want, to meet that demand. So you have a really high demand and you have a low supply. And what traffickers do, because they're incentivized to make money, is they try to increase that supply to meet that demand. And unfortunately and tragically, that supply means children, foreign nationals, people with profound backgrounds of child sexual trauma, mental health issues, people who are experiencing homelessness, right? The most vulnerable and marginalized people in our community are essentially, you know, constituting that supply in order to meet the demand. So our focus is on trying to reduce that demand, to try to shrink the market, with the idea that that is going to shrink the supply and therefore shrink the number of children that are being sex trafficked in the commercial sex trade. There's some bullet points that are hopefully going to come up here. And really, you know, I think that what we need to understand is that the buyers are directly and indirectly responsible for all of the harm experienced by people in prostitution, whether they're there voluntarily or otherwise. And what I mean by that is something that folks probably understand already, but there's a tremendous prevalence of violence in the sex trade. Overwhelming amounts of people who are being prostituted or engaged in sex work, and I'm sort of using those terms interchangeably depending on your lens, report being the victims of violence, right? They're raped, they're beaten, they're robbed, they're extorted. So they're providing the direct violence. There have been a number of studies that I thought I'd just talk about, and some of these are referenced later on in the source materials, which you'll have a copy of. One of the of the sex buyer said that a woman should do anything the sex buyer wants for it, anything at all. Another study, 50% of sex buyers who pay for sex knew that the person they were paying was under the control of a third party, like a pimp or a trafficker, and they just didn't care. One of the things that I know Elisa will talk about later on is just the understanding that the commercial sex trade is based on gender inequity and race inequity and income inequity. From my line of work, I am very confident in saying, based on the hundreds, if not thousands of cases I prosecuted, is that it's all men doing this harm, whether they're buying or they're creating the marketplace for this demand. The amount of women who are, buying sex is so statistically small that it doesn't have an impact. So to describe the demand for sex child trafficking requires us to look at how the demand for commercial sex is inextricably linked with the demand for child sex victims. Who are these buyers? Well, let me kind of talk to you about my work. We at the King County Prosecutor's Office have made it a focus for, close to a decade now on addressing the demand for child sex trafficking victims. And we have prosecuted hundreds of sex buyers who have intentionally or unknowingly bought or tried to buy sex from kids, from minors. I would say the significant majority of the cases we prosecute involve preventative policing operations where you have a detective online where we know there's a prevalence of sex trafficking who is posing as a fictitious minor. And the defendant is arrested when they show up at the hotel thinking they're going to meet a 15-year-old. And of course, they have the money in their pocket and the condom, and they have the cell phone that they were using to communicate with the detective. So we charge those cases, as well as cases where we have recovered and identified a real life child sex trafficking victim. And we've worked our way backwards to identify the sex buyers who have, showed up and purchased that child for sex, which constitutes the crime of commercial sex abuse of a minor, at least in Washington state. As part of that prosecution process, we require these offenders to go through a psychosexual deviancy evaluation performed by state certified sex offender treatment providers. Every state has some variation of what I'm talking about. And certainly if there's judges on this webinar, you folks know what I'm talking about as well. And in those evaluations, which are very robust with the amount of information they provide, we have been able to glean sort of certainly a convenient sample representation of these guys and their backgrounds. And what we have learned, which matches and very much mirrors other studies across the country, is that, again, these offenders are all men. They are disproportionately men who have incomes, who come from backgrounds of higher education. In other words, these are the people that are most privileged in our community. We have noticed that there are a prevalence of other issues that's really driving the behavior to buy sex, such as depression, other mental health issues, relationship difficulties. There's a myth that these guys are all pedophiles, right? Or have sexual deviancies. And in our work, and which again is consistent with other literature that we have seen, that is an inaccurate assumption. The reality is that these guys are opportunists, and they want what they want at the time that they want. At the end of the day, they don't really care if it's a 16-year-old or a 26-year-old. What is consistent is they want somebody who is young, right? They want a young person who is sort of just coming into the sex trade. And that is consistent across the board. One of the things we've also gleaned from the data that we have is that most of these guys who show up to buy sex with a minor have a history of buying sex before. And that is an interesting thing to look at, because oftentimes when we're outside the scope of a preventive policing investigation, real childhood trafficking victims actually lie about their ages. They're conditioned to lie. They are conditioned to go on whatever new Backpage website is out there and say they're 18 or 19. They're conditioned to, if they are on the street and a sex buyer cruises up in this car, you know, how old are you? They're conditioned to say I'm 19 or 20, even if they're as young as 13. And so oftentimes, because these guys weren't young, and because they're oftentimes, more than not, simply relying on the representation of a victim, they very well may have purchased sex from a minor in the past without even knowing it. Certainly in the cases we have where we're charging attempted commercial sex abuse of a minor, however, they go there with the clear knowledge and intent that they are meeting a minor for sex. The other interesting study that's I think is very consistent with what we see from our psychosexual deviancy evaluations is that a majority of active and past sex buyers either somewhat or strongly agree with the statement, I would like to stop buying sex. There's some level of compulsion in these men's history that's keeping them doing it. This is what they know. It's very unhealthy. At the end of the day, it's unsatisfactory, and they're exposing themselves to tremendous risk and legal jeopardy, rightfully so, by engaging in this type of behavior. I should also take a step back and talk more broadly that, you know, even though, you know, we know that based on this representative sample, you know, these are the things we know, but the vast majority of men in our community are not buying sex. There's some studies in the citations where anywhere from 10 to 20% of men some point in their life have bought sex. And that's actually a statistic that has gone down considerably over the last few decades. One of the reasons it's high at some point in their life, I think there's certainly a correlation with military service, which we could talk about for a long time. But, you know, the US government for a long time did not have regulations against patronizing prostitution when these guys would go overseas. And so oftentimes in the studies, you would say, yeah, I bought sex one time, but it was when I was 20 years old, I'm now 60, and it was when I was deployed. The reason I bring up the general prevalence is I want folks to understand the lens we're coming from means, based on the data, is that like men are not biologically programmed to go out or needing to buy sex. There's this kind of thing we hear oftentimes that like this is the oldest profession, and you know, boys will be boys, and that is just completely inconsistent with one, history, and then two, gender dynamics about what men need to do and don't need to do. We've looked at a lot of the data of our sample size, and again, I've talked about this repeatedly, but I think this highlights the gender inequity and also gender violence that's prevalent in the sex trade, given the fact that in the cases we've seen, 100% of them are males engaged in this type of childhood victimization. We go to the next slide. These numbers highlight the sort of the racial disproportionality we're seeing. Keep in mind that in King County, Washington, we are a disproportionately white community. And the number of, the percentage of sex buyers who are showing up to buy sex for minors or who have is, you know, just above 70%. That is actually higher than a neutral, the gender neutral number for King County in terms of its population of who identify as white people. So that's a staggering number when we show you some additional facts and data in the coming slides. We've also looked at where these guys are coming from in terms of their background, because again, one of our focus is identifying upstream intervention points. So one of the organizations that Elisa and our agencies worked for in the past is Businesses Ending Slavery and Trafficking, which has really kind of been a groundbreaking entity to go out and educate area employers on the dangers of sex buying and how that not only impacts reputation of companies, but also employers' bottom line, because we know money talks. Employers have the ability to really, from an upstream intervention point, stop sex buying and this type of behavior with their employers before the harm can happen. One of the things we've noticed is roughly 30% of the sex buyers we see are coming from a business or tech company, which usually, frankly, there's a correlation again with income based on these types of professions and education level. The vast majority of these guys are employed. So again, they are coming to a sex transaction with a pocket full of cash. They are men. They are disproportionately white, at least in the King County area, again, which mirrors different studies and literature around the country. And at the end of the day, think about what that means. You have literally the most privileged, powerful people with economic means deciding to show up at the doorstep of somebody who, based on our data, is incredibly vulnerable, marginalized, and disproportionately impacted by racism and other pre-existing trauma.
Thanks, Ben. I think you always do such a really great job of talking about who the sex buyers are and who you're seeing coming through your office, especially with regards to the CSEC and CSAM cases. I'm sorry, Judge Mack, did you want to say something? I apologize, I'm going to jump in. Nope, okay. So this is obviously just a very simple slide, an understanding of who are the victims. Now, I have worked in direct service agencies basically the entire time I've been doing this movement work, as it were, previously for the Organization for Prostitution Survivors and now for Thistle Farms. And I know when I worked for OPS, I definitely saw a number of these things happen. I was seeing who these people were. They were walking in our doors every day. And whenever I'm lucky and fortunate enough to go back to Nashville and sit in Circle, as we call it, which is like a once a week group of the entire community, we see over and over again who is most impacted by this. Who are the faces that I see every day? And disproportionately, these are people who are coming from communities of color. They're identifying as LGBTQ2IA+. They have prior histories of childhood sexual abuse, and they're also experiencing homelessness and instability in housing and food security at a very disproportionate rate. And what we're noticing, like Ben said, is that there are a lot of intersection points with basically your margins of oppression. So this is racial oppression, this is gender oppression, this is economic disadvantage. Recognizing that when your choice is to send your children to your abusive ex-husband or to prostitute to feed your family, there's not a lot of a choice, even if you're under the age of 18 and that is happening. Sending your children to your abusive family or into foster care. These are choices that no one wants to make. So basically, these are choices out of very limited context of choice. A lot of what we're talking about today is just agency and margins of that agency. One of the things that we haven't talked about yet is just the simple understanding of addiction and how addiction comes into play within victimology within a specific crime. Recognizing that a lot of people develop addictions after entering prostitution or the sex trade, or in these cases that we're talking about youth sex trafficking, because those are methods that traffickers do use to control the people within their stables, as it were, the lingo that we use. Additionally, you have to kind of involve yourself in a coping mechanism. So you're using a drug as a coping mechanism to cope with the trauma that's being inflicted on you day in and day out by sex buyers. And I just want to be really clear that I'm emphasizing that sex buyer portion of it because traffickers don't have a whole lot of incentive to, in other words, damage their product. Sex buyers, on the other hand, they've just rented you for an hour. I mean, I think we all understand what it is to rent a car and you get that like $5 insurance and you're like, yeah, I'm fine. This is kind of the same mentality they have. That enterprise rent-a-car, whoever it is renting you that car, has more economic incentive to make sure that car's okay, but you as the driver have less. Recognizing again that this is predominantly a racialized issue, we really do need to be talking about who is the most, you can go back one more slide, actually, I'm not quite done. I'll get there. That this is actually predominantly an issue of race and generalized oppression. And we do see this not just here in the United States, but we also see this across our globe. So it is true that across in Canada is predominantly Indigenous women and Asian migrant women who are in prostitution and have experienced sex trafficking as children. In New Zealand, it's Indigenous women. In Amsterdam, it's women from war-torn countries. It is women who are immigrating from Africa. And so just recognizing that this isn't just an issue that is like US based, but it is globally based, but the primary victim population is almost always staying the same. It's the most marginalized within a region. And so now you can go to the next slide really quick. I apologize about that.
Elisa, while we're going to the next slide, I have a question for you. How, if at all, has online grooming and recruitment changed who the victims are, or has it?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So online grooming is drastically changing not only the services that we need to provide victims, but it's also drastically changing who we are providing services to. Recognizing that it is girls that are younger and younger and younger who are being faced with the normalization of the sex trade, whether that is even simply through OnlyFans that they are seeing on their Facebook pages. And obviously, COVID-19 has done a very good job of spreading things like these concepts and paradigms into a younger population. So just to jump back in really quick, recognizing, and I actually, even though I'm based out of Washington, D.C. now, I still use these numbers from King County because I think they do such an amazing job of displaying who is actually within the sex trade and who is represented. We recognize that in the last, from 2011 to 2020, the CSEC victims by race, we had 38% were white, which is absolutely too large of a number. It's too large of a number for any racial identity, but 43% identified as Black. That is a much higher number than our demographic population within King County. I don't actually have that number in front of me right now, but I recognize that the proportion of people who are in King County who identify as Black is, I believe, in the 13 to 14% range. And yet 43% of the people within child sex trafficking, we are seeing as identifying as Black. And so recognizing that, if you could move to the next slide, please, that it is disproportionately white males with buying sexual access to disproportionately Black girls. And so we have the most privileged within our communities who are purchasing the least privileged within our communities for sex. And I think that that is just something that we really need to be aware of, especially when we're considering not just how to provide services, but how do we respond to this issue in a way that is going to hit it at the root, in other words. There's a survivor who's named Rachel Moran. She has this really great quote, and she says, "You cannot pull up a tree by just simply tearing at the leaves. You have to pull it up by the root." And this is what we're talking about when we're talking about going after the demand for commercial sex, and specifically the demand for commercial sex from children. Next slide, please.
Hey, Elisa, can I ask you a quick question before we go
Please
on?
do.
You know, we have this number from locally, and then also, you know, the national studies and data that we're seeing all the time. Pre-pandemic, what are you hearing from your close work with service providers across the country on a correlation between the pandemic, ongoing pandemic, and increased folks in the sex trade? Are also what has the pandemic, at least initially, and I know this is probably mostly anecdotally at this point, done to increase some of these disproportionalities that we're seeing?
Well, that's a really great question, Ben. A lot of that just simply has to do with the understanding the economic principles that we're facing right now as going through the pandemic. I mean, I don't think I can walk into a room of people and say, who hasn't been financially impacted by the pandemic? And everybody is going to raise their hand and say, yes, I've experienced this. However, a lot of the sectors that are being hit the most hard are sectors where we see more marginalized populations who are going into entry-level positions and generalized positions. And so, of course, those are the people who are getting laid off first. We are seeing that in very disproportionate numbers, and those are just simple labor organizing numbers that you can find on the internet. What the other side of that is that we're hearing anecdotally is that those are the people that are being faced with those hard choices. How do I feed my family? What are my options? And a lot of the times it is a lot of options out of other crappy options. So again, it is, okay, well, I can't find a job. I'm running out of my insurance is running out, or it's not enough to pay for the things that I need. And therefore I'm going to enter the sex trade because this is the best choice I have. And a lot of the times, like what Judge Mack was saying, that entry point into the sex trade is turning into something that is an online event. So it is like OnlyFans, it is like Sugar Babies or whatever that, I can't even remember the name of that website, Seeking Arrangements, I apologize. And so what we're seeing within service provision is having to be more cognizant about how people are entering, why they're entering, and what their long-term goals are for getting out. Because a lot of people are seeing this as like a point in time thing in their lives. They're like, oh, I just had to enter, I just am on OnlyFans for the next, year, or however long the pandemic lasts. But what I am wondering is, what's this going to look like in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Because I know very few survivors who went in saying, I'm only going to be here for a year, and didn't end up staying for 5, 10, 15 years. And so recognizing that the pandemic not only is impacting how we provide services now, but how we are probably going to continue to provide services into the future. Does that answer your question, Ben?
It absolutely does. And, I'll note that we saw a 163% increase in identifying child sex victims in our cases from 2019 to 2020. Now, I can't tell you that the pandemic caused that, but certainly there's a correlation. I can anecdotally tell you that in those cases that I know the fact patterns in, it's more kids spending time online, less parental supervision, less mentorship, less adults physically in that space. And that kind of creates a recipe for disaster if you've already experienced some level of marginalization or vulnerability. Because the unfortunate reality is there are folks online who are actively looking for these types of young people to target, whether it's I'm going to flip you $10 for a nude photo, or let's meet up, or OnlyFans accounts. The sugaring construct that we're seeing, where it's a watered down version of prostitution because I'm giving you a vape pen and a purse and a trip to wherever, as opposed to $100 for a sex act. I mean, this is the prevalence of these things, these types of things in our economy, our sex trade ecosystem economy, I should say, are pretty staggering. And I think that the folks who are going to study this in the future are going to really be able to pinpoint some actual causation.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that really quick as far as that goes, is one of the other things that you asked me specifically, some of the things I'm seeing, and some of the things that we are seeing going to what Ben's talking about less online supervision, but more time online. Traffickers specifically are spending more time with the people they are trafficking, and therefore it is harder for them to reach out. So even though you're also seeing an uptick in some instances of reporting, we're also seeing a downturn in other instances of reporting of people who are experiencing trafficking. I'm sorry, Judge Mack, I heard you.
Two things. One is, Ben, you've been asked to repeat the increase, and was it 2019 to 2020? And what was the percentage?
Yes, 163% percentage increase in identified CSEC victims from 2019 to 2020. And what I'll do, because I don't think it's actually included in our sources, is I will put a link to all the data my office collects in the chat. Give me a few minutes, but we'll include that as well.
And the only other thing I wanted to chime in on was that the victims by race chart only has 1% Native. And I want to make it clear that that is probably not an accurate reflection of the numbers. In areas where there are large tribal communities, we know that there are men who are targeting Indigenous kids and Indigenous women, partly because of jurisdictional issues between reservations and other lands. Just wanted to make that point. Sorry, Lisa, please move on.
No, it's totally okay. It's a wonderful point to make. And considering that, again, marginalization means less likelihood of interacting with law enforcement and criminal justice agencies. These numbers are all probably pretty low because these are all based off of prosecutions. And so I think we need to remember that these are only the identified victims that we've gotten in touch with. Sorry, Ben, I'm probably made an assumption on that, but I think I'm right. So Next slide, por favor. Great. Ben, do you want to get us started?
Do you, before we move on, is there anything else you want to talk about in terms of historical oppression, anything like that? I know we've covered much of it and we don't have a whole lot of time left, but we do have some before we get into our progressive work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that also could be a multi-day webinar series,
Yes.
just simply talking about the understanding of how historic oppressions have, really created a beautiful, fertile ground for traffickers to exploit individuals in. I mean, we have to think about the understanding of how has capitalism impacted Indigenous communities? How has colonialism still continuing to impact these communities? I do a lot of work looking at other countries and comparing what sex trafficking and prostitution looks like there compared back to the United States. And again, what I see is continued economic oppression of marginalized groups, and those groups being continuously oppressed through systemic racism and marginalization, and again, this intergenerational poverty. Specifically within Indigenous communities, of course, there's a much less likelihood of them having any interaction with a government that is not their own tribal government. And there is stigmatization within the understanding of childhood sexual abuse and things like that. And so these are issues that are going to be much, much, much underreported, and you're just not going to see it as much coming through. However, we as service providers do see these numbers over time, and we've actually seen increases of them over time. And I don't know if that's because of simply less stigma in the world, or if there's more need. All I know is that the people that I have traditionally served generally are not the first people in their family to have experienced this. They are the second generation, third generation, fourth generation. Additionally, on top of that, the other oppression I think I really just want to point out, when I first came to Thistle Farms, a lot of women were telling me that arrests saved their life. And I had a really hard time accepting that, recognizing that, these are people who were facing the incarceration in the criminal justice system. And what I realized is it wasn't the arrest that saved their lives, it was the services they got post-arrest that saved their life. But the interesting thing that I started noticing was that whereas a white survivor was likely to get a diversion earlier on an earlier arrest, a Black survivor was less likely to get that diversion until a much later arrest. And so recognizing that the criminal justice system has such a unique role to play within all of these contexts, and also we can also see how these historic oppressions are showing up within survivors' lives, whether they're children or adults, and how they exit and what those services look like, and how often they're even given to them or have access to them.
If I could just chime in with one other thing. We're talking about kids here, but the harm that's done lasts throughout a lifetime. There is a lot of information on the CDC website, on the Health and Human Services website. There's a study in the sources listed at the end of this of a study of 30 years worth of public records, health records, police records in Colorado Springs, Colorado, of nearly 2,000 women known to have been actively engaged in prostitution. It's a fairly old study, but it's consistent with other studies. The average age of death was 34. The number of homicides was very high. Most of those were committed by buyers. The lifelong harms caused when children are started along this path are indescribable, and it's one of the reasons the services that we're talking about are so important. Should we go on to our progressive work?
So this is a very broad topic too, and we're going to scratch the surface, which is great because I think that we're going to get some ideas flowing. And what I said earlier on in this presentation mirrors, I think, a lot of the work we do here in terms of what can we do outside of the criminal justice system to effectuate our goals, right? To reduce child sex trafficking in our community, to reduce harm in our community, to get people out of prostitution if they want to get out of it, and so forth. So again, our first and foremost thing is ensuring that people understand who is in the sex market. I mean, I think that unfortunately over the years, our media, the way we look at this, how we talk about it, lends itself to the idea that people in prostitution are all there by choice, or like what they're doing, want to be doing it. And that's just not consistent with real life experiences. My work is very much led by the survivor community that I have the honor of working with, and who really get to inform policymakers here on what the actual sex trade looks like. We are very much trying to get people out of the sex trade who don't want to be there, kids included. So to that end, and I know that Elise is going to talk about the exit ramps, but in terms of the criminal justice approach, one of the things that we're working hard to do is vacatur relief. And I think there's a number of folks on here who are involved in that work, but ensuring that people who have prostitution convictions on their records, criminal records, or convictions that are related, intertwined with being a victim of a trafficking or prostitution construct, are able to really vacate those records. Because that's one of the biggest ways that a child stays in the sex trade throughout their adult life, is they don't know any better, and then their pimp and trafficker is just calling them that, right? You're nothing but a hoe. You're nothing but what your criminal record shows. There's no way you're going to be employed by anything else than being out on the street. It creates barriers for housing, seeing the person's children, right? I mean, all sorts of barriers, volunteering at school, whatever the case may be. There is no, from my vantage point, there's no good from having a prostitution conviction on a record. It's not going to help community safety. It's only going to make that person more vulnerable and marginalized, which is going to increase the risk of trafficking. So one of the things we've been doing as a community is ensuring that people who have either juvenile or adult convictions for prostitution or related crimes can get those convictions off their records. We're also, again, increasing accountability for the people that are causing the harm, which is the demand. For a long time, I think right after the Trafficking Victim Prevention Act was finalized in the early 2000s, right? The big focus in this space was going after just the traffickers, right? It's just get the traffickers, this whole thing goes away. It's like, no, there's always going to be another person to fill the void of making money. So what we need to do is reduce the demand through the criminal justice system, and then as a community through a more public policy lens. So we're holding those buyers accountable. Accountability means different things to different people. And I think there's different policy approaches depending on a person's background. So I don't have a unique scheme necessarily, but one of the focuses that we do is ensuring that these sex buyers, these men, enter an accountability program. It's a 10-week program that's offered here locally, and we're trying to folks in many different spaces are trying to take the tenets of this program that was started by Elisa's organization, Organization for Prostitution Survivors, in really addressing the root causes of sex buying, understanding that this is not a victimless crime, right? And understanding sort of the root causes from a toxic accountability lens, a male entitlement lens, and then also addressing all the related things like domestic violence and human trafficking. This program is phenomenal. 93% of the program participants who leave say they'll never buy sex again. There's no reason for them to lie about that. It's not like they get a better deal if they lie and say the program is good and that their mindset has been changed. And then roughly half of the program participants, and I think this is the most compelling thing, continue to be involved in this men's accountability program. Like they literally sign on to meet together to discuss these issues, to provide community service for other gender violence movements. I mean, it's pretty phenomenal. I'll put a link to this course in the chat as well. But that's how we ensure that, to the extent that we can control recidivism after we arrest and prosecute somebody, that's the way we do it. And then we're also ensuring that people in prostitution locally are not criminalized. And so this is something that's interesting in King County, because we haven't changed laws. I mean, it is still a crime technically to commit prostitution in King County and Washington State, local cities here. But there has been an acceptance by local law enforcement and varying prosecuting agencies around King County, whether at the county level, like myself, who does felonies, or at the city level that prosecute misdemeanors, that, hey, there's no good reason to bring a charge of prostitution. So in 2020, this was the first time that there was literally 0 prostitution charges in King County, which was a major accomplishment. And you can see that data in the King County CSEC.org link that I included in the chat. So the criminal justice system has one framework of it, and then Elisa is going to talk about sort of the corollary. Yes, Judge Mack.
And how long since you've charged a child in King County? That was just an adult statistic.
That was, I believe it was 2009.
I think it was 2013, but I could be wrong.
No, you might be right. Yeah, it could have been 2013, somewhere in that time frame.
Okay. So yeah, the other framework that or the other aspect of the kind of really progressive work that I just really want to hit on really quickly is just recognizing that, the criminal justice system is awesome. We need it as one of the ways that we make sure that we are not only preventing but responding to this issue, but we do need to make sure we're involving other sectors and recognizing that there is a lot of education work that can happen, like Ben talked about, which is like a post-conviction or a tertiary intervention. But we could also be going upstream and talking to our young boys about how to become good men, how not to buy sex, how not to objectify women and girls, and then also empowering our young girls to become empowered women. So I just wanted to add that in there, recognizing that if we start talking about this with people, I always tell my friends, I'm like, I'm sorry, I know that you're uncomfortable talking about this, but I dare you to go talk to somebody at a bar about this. Have that conversation, see how you feel. How does it make them feel? Why is this issue so stigmatized in our society that we can't talk about something that's causing some of the most extreme harm to some of the most marginalized people? The only other thing I would just really want to add really quickly is just recognizing that progressive work like this that's based in criminal justice and education really needs to be balanced out with services. Diversion and expungement and vacatur are amazing and we need them. I'm working on updating our expungement laws in Tennessee right now. The reality is, though, is that that's great for people who already have a criminal record, but what about people who are in the life right now and exiting the life? We need to expand our understanding of services to expand to a continuum that includes everything from harm rejection all the way through to exit services and even aftercare. Again, recognizing that trauma is something you have your entire life. I don't think I've said it yet, but I am also a survivor of prostitution, and I actually entered at 18. Nothing magical happened on my 18th birthday to make it suddenly okay. It's just when I happened to enter. I also was engaged in survival sex when I was in about 15 or 16. And so recognizing that these things are still things that impact me today, 20-some years out of the life, is just recognizing that this is something that has lifelong consequences. And so providing harm reduction for people who are in this because they have to be and their only other choices are utterly crappy. Anybody who even wants to go into it, I believe that they deserve services because being bought for sex is traumatic. And then also recognizing that we need to provide exit services as well to make sure that anybody who wants to leave has the right to leave. They can leave, that right is not being denied to them. Why don't you move on to the next slide, please? See what we've got here. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we're just gonna, I recognize that we are really coming up on time. I want to be very cognizant of that. Why not just decriminalize or legalize prostitution? Ben actually put this really well right in the beginning, so I'm not even going to talk about it too much, but what I will say is that in one study of 150 countries, what we actually found was that when a country legalized or decriminalized prostitution, that the demand for commercial sex increased. There's an economic incentive at that point for traffickers to traffic more people, more children into the sex trade. So it's one of the reasons I always call this as like, you know, it's a system of prostitution, being trafficked into the system of prostitution, and recognizing that there is, again, that economic incentive for traffickers to put more victims and put more supply into that chain to meet that increased demand. There are a number of actually states and cities right now which are pushing for full decriminalization and legalization. And I think that's something that we're going to need to keep a very close eye on, recognizing how that will impact the survivors in that community, how that will impact the boys in that community, and how that's going to impact our children in those communities. Ben?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, at least in our work, we try to look at other ways of addressing the harms that folks who want to decriminalize or legalize are talking about for doing so. So let me give you an example. Number of years ago, we heard from folks who are in the sex trade that they are, you know, they are subjected to violence, right? That's an overwhelming fact. And they didn't feel comfortable coming forward to report being the victim of a robbery or rape because there was a concern that coming forward to report that and being honest about the circumstances would expose them to legal jeopardy, right? The police could turn around and A, say you're nothing but a prostitute, B, well, now I'm just going to arrest you for prostitution. Well, you know, fortunately in King County, we're not, again, the focus is not criminalizing people in prostitution, but, you know, I distinctly remember Elisa and I going down to talk to the legislature and having a law passed that provides explicit express immunity for people in prostitution reporting that they're a victim of a crime, right? So, I mean, we stood in lockstep with people who want to just open up the sex trade on this issue. And I think it was a beautiful compromise that really addresses the issue at hand, reduces harm, while simultaneously does not increase the market, does not let the market for commercial sex grow, which we think it will be harmful in the long term. And it also puts the dangerous sex buyers on notice that, hey, you can't go in there and do the things you've been doing because you actually are going to be more aptly exposed to legal jeopardy now if that person reports, which we want this law to incentivize them to do, knowing that they're not going to get in trouble for reporting. So it's examples like that. I think there's so much common ground we can find without growing the sex trade and increasing the demand. And that's what we're doing here in King County. That's what folks around the country are doing. And I would encourage all of us to look in our own jurisdictions on ways we can do this, small and big.
I have a couple of questions for either of you. One of the things we read about is especially young women and young college women thinking that the ability to do whatever you want with your body is a feminist issue. How do you address that, Elisa? This issue of, well, it's my body, I can do anything I want with it. Don't tell me what I can and can't do.
I would say I don't disagree with that. You know, the reality is that these are our bodies. We do have our agency and things like that. And also, I'm going to say that the majority of people I talk to who've experienced the sex trade are not in that group. And so myself, as somebody who works specifically in policy, I am going to always make sure that I am creating policy that is focused on the majority, not just the people who I'm seeing as kind of this minority within this group. The only thing I'll add to that is just recognizing that, well, actually two things. One, I think that we've equated sex positivity to prostitution in a lot of ways, and I think we just need to recognize that maybe these two things are not necessarily the same. And the other thing that I'll say is just recognizing that there's an economic factor here that drives somebody into prostitution. You know, just because you can make money in prostitution, that's not necessarily an argument for prostitution. That is an argument for better education, equal pay, economic opportunities for women, girls, and marginalized groups, specifically feminized bodies. So I don't disagree that, sure, I mean, if you can do this by full agency and choice, that is amazing and more power to you. And also, I want to make it as less harmful as I possibly can and shrink it down.
I've read in some of the studies about what's happened in other countries that where brothels are legal, including rooms with panic buttons, but where brothels are legal, it turns what a person who used to be considered a pimp into a legitimate businessman, business person. How do you deal with that? Is that true as far as you know? Do you know folks who've been through those legalized systems?
Yeah, I do actually have a few friends who've gone through I'm so sorry, my dog just yacked. Well, that just made this webinar just amazing for me. I'm so sorry. Yes, I do have friends that have been through the legal brothel, specifically in Nevada, but also other brothels within other states like New Zealand, Amsterdam, places like that. Yes, there are definitely instances where you see the panic buttons in the rooms. What I always say to that is, unless you're right on top of it, that is not going to do anything for you. Also recognizing that in Germany, they've actually outlawed pillows in most brothels just because they've been too often used as suffocation devices. What I'll say with regards to the managers, what we've actually seen is that there is such a normalization of this, that the way brothels are run in those countries is kind of like a salon, or even like a strip club, if you really want to kind of get down to the nitty gritty, where you have a business owner who employs individual contractors and independent contractors. That manager is actually the one with more rights within that equation than the independent contractor, because they do not have the right to unionize. There's also a number of other issues within this, specifically regards to employment laws. There have actually been recorded instances of women who have lost unemployment insurance in these countries when they have turned down jobs at brothels. There's been instances of buyers who've attempted to sue the women in these countries who did not provide adequate services. So just recognizing that, like, when we talk about this, we really need to think about the longer and further implications of what does this mean for business? What does this mean to do business within the sex trade? What does it mean for the people who are independent contractors who, though they are the ones that are providing the direct services, they are not the ones who have the right to unionize or organize to fight for better conditions.
Thank you. I want to get to the questions that have been asked on the Padlet. The first one that was asked was, has there been an analysis of the victims coming from poverty across racial lines? Are white and Black victims primarily from an impoverished background? My understanding of that is the answer is yes, generally speaking, but Elisa, Ben?
I think poverty is there's certainly a correlation there, as well as children who come in from child welfare, and also children who have experienced prior sexual abuse. The ACEs score on these kids is just off the charts. And if you have worked with them in a service provision role, or if you've been a family court judge or juvenile court judge with children who have been sex trafficked, I mean, the multi layers of trauma that you see about, you read about, it's the most tragic, depressing stuff you'll see. So I think yes on poverty, but there's so many other things. You could have somebody, I mean, I've had victims who've come from very middle class homes and have been, had access to education, to healthcare, supportive parents, but then they got, substance abuse took over, or there was a mental health diagnosis that took over, and you go down that rabbit hole, and then you're out on the street and you're being raped and you have a trafficker. And so that same level of trauma can come from so many different angles. I think what's abundantly clear from the literature is that these are not situations where we have, kids just being snatched off the street, put it in carts, and then, taken around, sex trafficked. There's some level of vulnerability or marginalization that's inherent in these children where they need to have services, they need help. And unfortunately, what happens first is a trafficker or a sex buyer comes into the equation.
Was there anything you wanted to add on that, Elisa? Because there are a couple more questions here I think we should get to.
I think that was outstanding.
How many states have vacatur procedures, and can youth get vacatur in Washington prior to turning 18? I believe Shared Hope has all of the state vacatur laws on its website, but you may know better than I do. Is that correct, Lisa?
Shared Hope does. Shared Hope absolutely does have that information correct. There are a couple of states that we have to remember that there is a difference between vacatur and expungement, and as well as criminal record sealing. And so I would say that most states have some variation on all of those, one, if not more of those things. However, I think Maine, maybe one more state, it doesn't allow vacatur, expungement, or criminal record sealing of any kind. So just kind of recognizing that it's a very varied country. I've had the pleasure of getting to drive all the way across it earlier this year and recognize that it definitely looks different depending upon where you are. So Ben, I'm sure you know about the Washington state specifically.
For youth.
Yeah, well, I think, youth records are generally sealed in Washington. So the same concerns don't necessarily apply. I did also put in an ABA stuff, a guide that's super helpful for folks if they want to check that out later.
Thank you. Going to the last question that's on the Padlet. I've heard the argument that criminalization of prostitution, and this sounds like criminalization of all parties in prostitution, as opposed to the equality or Nordic model. But I've heard the argument that criminalization of prostitution puts power into the buyer's hands. For example, it gives the buyer the power to negotiate things like where and when the sex work occurs, keeping it hidden and therefore making sex workers more vulnerable to unsafe situation. Do you have thoughts on this argument, Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually say it's not necessarily an untrue statement. Recognizing that the person within a criminalization paradigm who is most likely to get arrested isn't the buyer, it's going to be the prostituted person. And so what I would actually recommend to that is flipping that dichotomy on its head and creating some equity within that equation. What I believe is that models like the equality model, which decriminalize people within prostitution while criminalizing sex buyers, allows actually for far more agency of the people who are in prostitution. They can approach criminal justice agency at any point and say, this person is purchasing sex from me, and they can actually have that acted on. They don't have to have had something extremely violent happen to them to prove that there was an issue here. And so recognizing that it's basically shifting the power dynamic from the person who is purchasing sex to the person who is selling sex. The other side of that is just recognizing that sometimes there's this concept of screening, of whether or not people who are in prostitution can screen better if prostitution were completely decriminalized. I don't make a really great argument on that. There's actually a survivor named Jay who is with the Northwest Survivor Alliance who does an absolutely fabulous job on this, but recognizing that no screening tool is going to keep you safe if that buyer is having a crappy day. And so I just think it's just one of those things where we need to, again, shift our paradigm away from either fully criminalize or fully legalize or fully decriminalize and find something in the middle that works for everybody.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Ben?
No.
The last question that's on the Padlet, I may be missing something in the chat, is, do you know of any resources that could be shared with the average person about the harm of child sex abuse material, thinking about people who defend someone who is purchased because they haven't actually touched a child? This is child sexual abuse material and child online sex trafficking is something we have not covered here because it's an enormous topic. There is a lot of material available on that. The Department of Justice works on it. The Internet Task Force, Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force works on it. I could get that material. I don't have my hands on it right now. We're going to put in the chat box at the end of this contact information for all three of us. You're welcome to contact any one of us for additional information. The bottom line, this isn't resources, is that the harm of child sex abuse material is there is a child being abused, and every single viewing of child sex abuse material is an additional trauma for that child. There was a series of articles in the New York Times a couple of years ago about that kind of abuse. There have been a lot of studies done about that kind of ongoing abuse, and that just creates a market. The person who doesn't touch the child but buys the material is creating the market. It's exactly what we talk about here. It's just a different market for child sexual abuse. Ben?
Yeah, there's so much literature on this that it's beyond me. I want to go back to the earlier question because I just thought of something. I never need to like talk after Elisa does because she says everything and knows everything. But I just had one thought, and that was, kind of an anecdote or a vignette I can share. My office prosecuted a case a few years ago that garnered national attention because it was this group of men who had created these online platforms. And they were all interested in Korean prostituted women. And they created literally a review board where it was like Yelp or Craigslist for prostitution, and they would rate these women. And, the concept of like decriminalizing prostitution, putting powers, or taking away power from the sex buyers, we didn't see that because you kind of had this universe operating with complete impunity. And what these guys would do is they would rate the women. And when the women didn't do what the guys wanted them to do, or didn't perform the sex act, or didn't charge the price, they would write negative reviews about her. And they would, ostensibly make it so that it was very hard for her to get business. She would either have to lower her prices to attract more of the demand, or she would have to finally to succumb to the men's disgusting sexual preferences in order to get back in good grace with them. And I think that's what's going to happen in a marketplace like this. The concept of like putting the control on the prostitute woman, no, it's just not going to happen. Not only based on economics, but based on just the underlying gender violence that the sex trade is going to be is made of. These sex buyers will find a way, come hell or high water, to get exactly what they want from these victims. And so, I've seen that happen in real time through this case, and we see it happen in other countries. You go to Germany, you take an 18-year-old boy to Germany on his first brothel trip, and he's in a brothel with all of these women who are not from Germany. They're all from East Africa and Asia. And what does that tell you about kind of from a colonialism, sexism lens? Like, okay, these people are below me and I can just pay them any amount of money and I'm going to do whatever I want with them. I mean, the idea that this represents female empowerment is so antithetical to how we see this operate in real life. It's beyond me. So I'm ranting at this point, but I just wanted to say a few.
No, and I appreciate you bringing that one up, Ben. That was actually, so little personal note, the review board is actually where I was prostituted. So I can verify that everything that Ben just said is 100% true. And I think, again, we're again talking about empowerment, we're talking about agency, we're talking about choice. And one of the things that I really want to hit in on with the regards to like screening is just that it just puts so much of the onus back on the prostituted person, whether that's a child or an adult. It's very victim blamey that way of like, oh, well, you just didn't screen them well enough. And I think we need to kind of shift out of that and into a more, well, again, it's that asking a question of like, why did you stay? The question isn't why do you stay? The question is, why do people think they have the right to buy other people's bodies for sex?
There are a couple of resources that are attached to the slides here that, and again, these are just 2 or 3 resources that will connect you to other materials on this topic and others. Is there anybody who wants to unmute and ask a question verbally? I don't see any more questions in the Padlet or in the chat box.
Sure. I'll go ahead and ask mine. I kind of added it to the little sticky. That was my little purple sticky. Wanted to kind of drill in on the, not being a lawyer and working with adolescents who are victims and survivors of sex trafficking. I'm just wondering if vacatur is available to them prior to 18. And if so, specifically vacatur, who would I hook them up with? Or is that something I can just like call Ben and ask later or something?
I think
Good to see you, Judy. Yeah, let's connect later because I could go into the rabbit hole, but it's all very much Washington State, and you and I will connect. Judy is one of our best advocates in Washington State, so happy you're here, Judy.
But it is true that in King County, in Washington State, all juvenile records, misdemeanor records in particular, are sealed automatically after a certain amount of time. So there's really much less of a vacatur issue. Anything else? If not, I want to thank you all for joining us today. I also want to say, if you're not a member of NCJFCJ, please think about joining. You do not have to be a judge to join. There are lots of training opportunities besides webinars, and there are a lot of benefits to being a member. I want to thank again Ben and Elisa for the wonderful work they do, and Elisa for jumping in with 24 hours notice to help us with this, and to Kira for the preparation she did, even though she couldn't be here. So thank you all. We'll see you at some other time. Thank you. And thank you also very much to Lauren and Malika for doing the magic that helps make all this possible.